So I would like to start session 3, Overseas Exhibitions and Discourses of Modern and Contemporary Japanese Art. Well, since last night, actually, the Shinkansen bullet train has stopped its operation due to bad weathers, and I was supposed to be here at the venue and to be able to facilitate the discussion together with the panelists, but unfortunately, I had to stay in Tokyo, so that's why please allow me to join from Zoom. And this session, well, during the Meiji era, Japan has been exhibiting many or organizing many exhibitions to introduce Japanese art. And this modern and contemporary Japanese art is something that we want to question how they have been received overseas. So that is why, as part of the Bunka-cho Contemporary Art Platform project, we have been translating various critical texts and articles on modern and contemporary Japanese art. And these activities in the recent 5 years have been focused from the historical perspective, and that is why we have been trying to observe how these Japanese art has been interpreted and observed and perceived outside Japan. We have 3 valued panelists today. Let me introduce them. And by the way, we have intentionally focused on how Japanese art has been perceived in the US. And later we have Chelsea Foxwell to give us a presentation. And even in the past 10 years in the US, various Japanese art in the post-war has been introduced in various exhibits. And in the number of exhibits being made, we believe that US is one of the prominent countries. And that is why we have focused on how Japanese art has been understood and perceived in the US. So we have been observing the modern and contemporary art exhibitions. So if we want to have this being made outside Japan, of course, Europe and East Asia is also another area, and we should also include those. But due to the time limitations, we have narrowed down and focused in the case of US. Yet, we are very happy to welcome 3 valued presenters because they have been engaging in various areas, and we'll be able to get a lot of insights from different angles today. So let me introduce to you the 3 panelists. First, we will welcome Bert Winther-Tamaki-san. He is the professor of art history at University of California, Irvine campus. And he has been focusing on transnationality and properties. And recently, the Tsuchi, Earthy Materials in Contemporary Japanese Art, is his latest book. It has been published by the University of Minnesota Press. And this includes a critical approach, and he has observed about the art. And on top of that, he has published 2 monographs. In 2001, he published Art in the Encounter of Nations, Japanese and American Artists in the Early Post-War Years. And in 2012, he published a book on maximum embodiment, yoga, the Western painting of Japan. And currently, he is a visiting foreign research scholar at the University of Tokyo, and we would like to welcome him. And the second presenter is Gabriel Ritter. He is an associate professor at University of California, Santa Barbara. And he is also the director of the University Museum. And he's a curator and an art historian himself. and in avant-garde visual art practices of modern and contemporary Japan, ranging from surrealism of the 1930s to bodily abstraction of the Gyutai Art Association, and as well as the concept of nonsense as a critical lens for critiquing the status quo and connecting Dada-inspired, socially engaged anti-art practices of the 1960s. So during the war, the Japan-China War, up to the Fukushima nuclear power plant issue, well, there has been a lot of crisis in Japanese history, and he has been bringing the topic of avant-garde art production during those times. And before UC, he was a creator in the Minneapolis Museum has been focusing on colored people and female artists as well as LGBTQI artists who have disclosed that. And he has been contributing immensely to diversifying the contemporary art collection. The third presenter we have is Chelsea Foxwell. She is associate professor of University of Chicago. And she has been seeking images, and her publications include Making Modern Japanese Style Painting, Kana Hogai, and The Search for Images. In the same time, there is this Awash in Color, French and Japanese prints, as part of her contribution. Her research has been supported by the Fulbright Program, Japan Foundation, and the Getty Research Institute and Harvard's Reichsfire Institute of Japanese Studies. And together with Dr. Bailey of the Museum of Fine Arts, she is now co-curating an exhibition on 19th century Japanese art called Meiji Modern, and this will be opened in late 2023 in various venues. And she has also a work on a book about art and circulation of images in the late Edo period in Japan. So we would like to welcome Bert Winther-Tamaki. You have the floor.
Good morning. I want to start by saying thank you very much to Kataoka Mami-san for organizing this amazing program, the Japan Art Platform, and to Kajiya Kenji for putting up with the typhoon and for organizing this particular panel. 3 large traveling exhibitions of contemporary Japanese art were held in quick succession in the United States from 1986 to 1990, constituting a remarkable chapter in the history of the genre of the diplomatic nation-based exhibition of contemporary art. Such exhibitions dispatch works of art to correct, deepen, and expand or improve the image of a nation among foreign viewers. This was a time when Americans were at once astonished, fascinated, and wary of Japanese economic power. These shows promoted the distinctive views of Japan suggested by their titles: Tokyo Form and Spirit, Against Nature, and Primal Spirit. All 3 were organized by American curators who were long on experience of modern and contemporary art, but knew little about Japan before embarking on these projects. They were assisted by to various degrees by counterparts in Japan, and their exhibition budgets were supplemented by funding from Japanese public and private sources. They presented completely different selections of Japanese contemporary art, but all sought noteworthy qualities of Japaneseness, and this identifies them with the Nihonjin-ron, a popular discourse of Japanese people that was energized by the economic ascendancy of Japan. Each exhibition emerged from the overlap between the Orientalist impulses of its American protagonists and the cultural nationalism of Japanese contemporaries. This study assesses several types of response to these exhibitions. Reviews published in contemporaneously in American media, subsequent exhibitions, since they were devised in part in response to their predecessors, and a historical reconsideration of their legacy today. ちょっとこのところで日本語に説明を加えますが、
Let me add some comments here in Japanese. I believe many of the participants today do remember about this exhibition. I think Eriko-san from Osaka shared her experience with us yesterday about the exhibit in the center, and she was also in charge of the photography here. And I personally remember this too. That was in the 1980s, and for 3 years with the Seibu Museum of Art and Asian Cultural Council, I was also engaged in that. And I met some of those curators at the time, and that is why I wanted to include those good memories in today's presentation. And some newspapers and articles in the US have been featuring this, and we really got a lot of feedback about this exhibition. For example, the curators' words were being cited sometimes, and sometimes there were criticisms even without viewing those artworks, and there were also very keen observations and analysis being made. And I am not the first person to make research on this area. And from the very beginning, I was on the Japanese side to see how modern and contemporary Japanese art will be perceived in the US. Well, this has been the focus. And Kyoko Mitsuyama and today's moderator, Kenji Kajiya, has also been making outstanding researches on this topic.
Tokyo Form and Spirit was organized by the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis with financial support from Japanese and American private and public funders wishing to increase Japanese investment in the American Midwest. Strictly speaking, this was not a show of contemporary Japanese art. Rather, it featured graphic design, architecture, and performance in what may have been a vestige of the Orientalist disregard for Asian genres associated with the lofty heights of the Kantian hierarchy of arts. Contemporary Japanese painting and sculpture were deemed lesser accomplishments. Instead, the curators turned to architects and designers to create 7 new installations emblematizing aspects of life in Tokyo: walking, spirit, etc., as listed on the right-hand column. These themes were imaginatively interpreted by the designers and juxtaposed with galleries of Japanese antiquities. In curator Martin Friedman's words, quote, "Rather than systematically trace this evolution of specific objects, we have concentrated on less tangible qualities which, from a Western point of view, seem quintessentially Japanese. Thus, speculative representations of presumed transhistorical precepts of Japanese culture were foregrounded, with little concern for narrating their historical development. These details of the working section of Tokyo Form and Spirit typify the old-new logic employed throughout the exhibition. A catalog essay titled Work as a Form of Beauty by the writer Ian Buruma ascribes aesthetic qualities to a wide array of Japanese labor practices, such as the so-called ballet-like movements of assembly line workers and the uniforms and gestures of elevator operators in department stores. This was a time when American industry seemed to have descended into a rust belt, and Japanese management was greatly admired and emulated. On the left, a late Edo period painting by Hokusai depicts a trio of beautiful women playing at the pseudo work of collecting the shells that ornament the beach. On the right is a detail of one of the etched plexiglass panels designed by the architect Hara Hiroshi to symbolize work imagined as a universalizing potential of human figures enabled by new technologies. In the future, Hara explained, the boundary between the extent to which work will be carried out by humans and machines will be unclear. And he postulated a basis for this ambiguity in Buddhist thought. The exhibition suggested cryptic continuities between picturesque vignettes from the past, whether Buddhist or ukiyo-e, and slick technology of the moment. Similar juxtapositions proliferated across the sprawling galleries and catalog pages of Tokyo Form and Spirit. After inspecting the exhibition, a New York Times critic announced his sweeping verdict: Japanese character is, quote, pragmatic, direct, and accepting of the world. The view is ironic, but knowing, self-assured, and confident. In 1986, the year when Tokyo Form and Spirit opened in Minneapolis and traveled to New York City, the Japan Foundation invited a group of American museum professionals to visit Japan and become acquainted with Japanese contemporary art. Thomas Sokolowski and Kathy Holbright were part of this group and took up the gauntlet to organize the exhibition realized as Against Nature 3 years later. They invited 2 curators in Japan, Komoto Shinji and Nanjo Fumio, to help them navigate what was a new culture for them. Their exhibition shared with Tokyo Form and Spirit a bias, next please, a bias for city life. Next slide, please. A bias for city life, clashing heterogeneity and a decorative impulse. But this exhibition focused on art rather than design and insistently opposed the fixation on pure Japanese culture by celebrating kitsch hybrid formations and relating them to postmodern thought. Morimura Yasumasa's photograph of himself performing as black and white females in Manet's Olympia embodied a radical hybridity in the artist's own flesh. In the curatorial thinking of the exhibition, however, Morimura's assimilation of foreign bodies and identities was not a rejection of Japanese exceptionalism. The curators imagined distinctively Japanese modes of importation, enculturation, and transmutation. During the course of a conversation between the curators, which was published in the catalog, the possibility that, quote, Japaneseness was no longer even viable was raised by Kathy Holbright. But the discussion then turned to a series of questions about Japan posed by the Americans and familiar shibboleths of Japanese identity with which their Japanese colleagues replied. Kathy Holbright has become a kind of interesting figure for me in this project, and I'm going to be interviewing her very soon. I'm looking forward to her perspectives. Nonetheless, the polemical stance telegraphed by the title, Against Nature, cast the exhibition in an abrasive tone. Anonymous Japanese government officials initially balked, and securing their agreement to fund an exhibition with this title required considerable persuasion. The curators justified their view by citing a tendency toward skeuomorphic renditions of one material by another in Japanese cultural history, and pointing to popular cultural forms of artifice, such as plastic sprays of cherry blossoms installed on utility poles. The exhibition's opposition to nature exceeded plastic artifice, however. Next, please. The artist Tsubaki Noboru declared, "I hate nature. I'm an urban creature. I know nothing about the countryside. In fact, it frightens me. This idea of Japanese people being at one with nature and with the purity and wholeness of nature is nothing I understand. I am very much against that." Such intemperate thoughts seemed brashly expressed in Tsubaki's sculpture, which a New York Times critic described as, quote, "a 9-foot tall yellow pod, like the heart of some spectacular beast, from which protrude vines and branches. It is a terrifying view of nature." For this critic, the artists of Against Nature forego lotus blossoms for urban blight. Some critics accepted prima facie that the art exhibited was a bearer of truth about Japanese social experience. And no doubt this view appealed because it reconciled the contradiction between conventional narratives of a tradition-bound, nature-loving Japan and current news items about such phenomena as the large trade imbalance between the US and Japan. For a Time magazine critic, the exhibited works, quote, "demonstrate just how much further Japan's children of the post-war economic miracle have gone in breaking the old rules. The post-Hiroshima generation has grown up in a technology-driven, fiercely consumerist, information-saturated urban setting, far removed spiritually from Mother Nature." Extreme alienation from the natural environment was apparently the consequence of the ravages of Japanese hyperdevelopment. A critic of the Texas newspaper, the Houston Chronicle, concluded that, quote, "seduced by the glitz and glitter of Western society, these artists are reacting to the turmoil it wreaks on their own." Kondo Yukio, curator at the National Museum of Modern Art, Tokyo, surveyed the American reviews of Against Nature in 1989 and concluded that such views of Japan harbored a disturbing vision of America. I think Kondo's observation here is very smart. Quote, "From the point of view of those in Europe and the US, Japan was a mirror of their own devising that reflected their own image, the good and bad points of Euro-American culture projected onto a different culture provided the opportunity to reevaluate the limits of their own culture." Primal Spirit was organized almost simultaneously with Against Nature, and the impulses of Against Nature with a retrenchment to an aesthetic of a climate-based sense of authenticity. Yet in 1990, primal spirit could also be seen as an elevation of cultural difference, aligned with views voiced in contemporaneous debates about multiculturalism. In this sense, primal spirit extended Magicians of the Earth, a landmark exhibition at the Pompidou Center the previous year that brought works by contemporary artists from all over the world together with works by Euro-American artists. Much as the Pompidou sought to import artists' magic from the global South to a Europe that had presumably been alienated from the Earth, primal spirit effected an infusion of so-called homegrown Japanese wood as a palliative and antidote to the excesses of urban civilization of the West. Howard Fox, curator of contemporary art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, was the organizer of Primal Spirit, and his catalog essay advocates a view of contemporary Japanese art that was greatly shaped by Toshio Hara, a Tokyo patron and museum director who provided substantial support. In a preface to the catalog, Hara decried Westerners' failure to recognize the merit of contemporary Japanese art and advocated a post-monoha approach. Fox had little knowledge of monoha art or theory, but pursued a deep sense of attachment to wood and other natural materials that he supposed was embedded in Japanese religious culture, and selected works that embodied this presumed indigenous predisposition. He was aware that much Japanese contemporary art, notably that featured in Against Nature, contradicted this premise, but excluded such work from his exhibition and denounced Westerners' narcissistic habit of favoring Western-influenced Japanese art. A Los Angeles Times critic quoted Fox's objection to Westerners' blindness approvingly, quote, "An act of colonialism, an abrogation of responsibility. Western culture puts a high value on originality. Not looking for it in Japanese art is a mockery." However, another reviewer of Primal Spirit, Lynn Cook, who at this time was surveying art from around the world in her capacity as co-curator of the 1991 Carnegie International, countered that, quote, "The attitudes Fox upheld as pure Japanese can no longer be filleted from Western or even modernist impulses." And she pointed out, far from uniquely Japanese, Fox's artists' attitudes were very similar to those of numerous non-Japanese contemporaries, such as the British artist Richard Long. Cook was also one of the first to highlight the rejection of the thesis of primal spirit by several artists in the show itself. Kawamata Tadashi's installation of a scaffolding-like arrangement of wooden boards across exterior surfaces of the museum is remembered today as one of the most arresting works in the exhibition. And I'm grateful to LACMA curator Hollis Goodall for sharing her memories of this exhibition with me. Kawamata delivered an especially wounding renunciation of primal spirit. Quote, that there is a Japanese quality in Japanese art is something that other countries than Japan have invented. In any case, I don't think Japanese artists have made anything with a Japanese quality. Kawamata's rejection of national content is categorical, but he illuminates illuminates a subcurrent of Nihonjinron thought that pays very close attention to foreign views of Japan. Foreigners, and perhaps foreign curators in particular, were sometimes deemed well-suited to the task of defining Japanese culture by virtue of their external perspective. Kawamata, however, as if to put to rest once and for all any lingering association with traditional Japanese woodwork, dramatically changed his installation for Primal Spirit at its showing in Canada. He built 35 makeshift huts to create a temporary shanty town titled Favela in the pristine new garden in front of the National Gallery in Ottawa. And I don't have a picture of it, so I'm showing a similar installation at Kassel in Germany by Kawamata. The term favela associates this work with Brazil, specifically the ad hoc shelters constructed by the poor in the Sao Paulo ghetto, which Kawamata visited. Outraged Canadians who perhaps anticipated that Kawamata would garnish their landscape with picturesque motifs from Japanese garden tradition, protested what they believed was an eyesore at the heart of their capital city. The March 1990 issue of Art News is perhaps the most striking artifact of the impact of the Primal Spirit and Against Nature exhibitions. 6 articles vouch for the exciting potential of new art and art institutions in Japan, spotlighting many of the artists and curators in these exhibitions. The cover illustrates a version of Morimura's interpolation of Manet with the headline, "A New Face of Japan." Reading this headline brings to light a dubious assumption underlying the genre of the nation-based exhibition, for surely the notion that Morimura's fabulous, creative, transnational, transracial, and transgender shape-shifting could serve as a representative visage of the Japanese people would be an unreliable ethnographic claim. For their part, advertisers were slow to warm to the idea that going against nature could be an effective way to stimulate American interest in Japan. Japan Airlines ran an ad in this very issue of Art News that leveraged the stereotypes that Against Nature attacked. To be sure, in addition to the kitsch and hybrid imagery of Against Nature, the Art News journalists also acknowledged the minimal, fibrous, and earthy or tradition-based emphasis of Primal Spirit. Thus, despite the competing advocacy of the exhibitions themselves, the types of art they promoted came to be understood as 2 fundamental and complementary aspects of contemporary Japanese art. An exhibition at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, curated by Kathy Hallbright, a member of the Against Nature team, provides a more nuanced evidence of this new awareness of contemporary Japanese art. Hallbright selected works by 15 artists to identify, quote, a particular set of intellectual concerns that have informed the cultural dramas of the 1980s. 14 of her artists were from Western Europe and North America. And the 15th was Morimura Yasumasa, straight out of the Against Nature exhibition and the cover of Art News. In Washington, however, his works no longer served as a new face of Japan. Here he was grouped with Sherry Levine, Jeff Koons, and Cindy Sherman, artists who shared predilections for reproduction, a relativized sense of authorship, and found imagery. But while these artists' American identities are taken for granted, the catalog discussion of Morimura is strongly marked by culturalist preoccupations such as, quote, Morimura believes the function of art is to help the artist speak out, something Japanese men normally, I can't read this with a straight face, normally the Japanese men normally do only after drinking. In addition to her inclusion of Morimura, another trace of Hallbright's recent work on Against Nature in the Washington exhibition appears on the catalog cover, which you see on the left, which features a detail of the Japanese 1,000 yen note as one of 4 signature emblems of the 1980s, each dispersed into the 4 ink printing plates, magenta, yellow, cyan, and black. This design is not a work by Morimura or any other artist in the exhibition, but rather a designer's visualization of Hallbright's schematic benchmarks of the 1980s. Moving from the left column to the right, the AIDS virus under a microscope, the explosion of the NASA Space Shuttle Challenger, a Rasterops video display card for Macintosh computers, and the 1,000 yen note. Japan is positioned as a symbol of the decade, a time when, in Hallbright's words, everywhere, from Wall Street to Gdansk, to the Kremlin to Tiananmen Square, money spoke louder than any ideology. Thus, Japan epitomized the hyper-monetized culture of the 80s. And I think it should be stressed that this reputation colored the American reception of contemporary Japanese art exhibitions throughout the period of the bubble economy. In 1994, the tendencies championed by Primal Spirit and Against Nature reemerged in yet another exhibition, but were now incorporated among numerous other streams in a much more comprehensive and complex account. Japanese art after 1945, Scream Against the Sky, held at the Yokohama Art Museum and the Guggenheim Museum in New York, attempted to correct the failure of its predecessors to situate contemporary Japanese art in a narrative of 20th century historical and art historical developments. Instead of the impressionistic explanatory matchups of artworks to presumed native attributes or historical antecedents, Scream Against the Sky offered a detailed account of artistic responses to historical, political, economic forces. In part, this accomplishment was enabled by the fact that the curator, Alexandra Monroe, did not enter this project as a newcomer to Japan like her predecessors, but was a specialist with requisite knowledge and training. Thus, Scream Against the Sky marks a significant turning point in the presentation of contemporary Japanese art in the US. I participated in this project with a small essay in this catalog and was very grateful, and am very grateful for that opportunity, though it was so early in my career that I can't bring myself to reread this essay anymore. Nonetheless, I mention it now because it deals with Japanese American artists, and I think it is significant that this perspective was embraced as a part of the story of contemporary Japanese art. Yet, in what is surely the most penetrating response to such exhibitions, art historian Mimi Ying Pruksawan criticized Scream Against the Sky for, quote, seeking national characteristics in art, a stance, she noted, that brought the project within the rubric of Nihon Jinron. She maintained that, quote, isolating uniquely Japanese components and, in fact, a Japanese psyche distorted the analysis of internationalizing works. In fact, doubts about the whole enterprise of conveying a deep truth about the Japanese nation by displaying works by artists in Japan were threaded throughout these endeavors, including Kathy Hallbright's misgivings about whether Japaneseness was even a viable idea, Tsubaki's abhorrence of the presumed Japanese sensitivity to nature, or Kawamata's rejection of the thesis of primal spirit. Noting how the world was being reshaped by astonishing magnitudes of globalization, in his essay for an exhibition in Germany in 1990, Nanjo Fumio questioned, quote, "Is it still meaningful to designate an exhibition with the name of a nation?" Though he answered his question to the affirmative, asserting that art has the potential to convey a sense of the reality of people living in that nation. Nevertheless, the display of contemporary art of a nation to foreign audiences has continued to provoke such questions. Such exhibitions have been faulted for boxing the artist into the role of emissary of the nation, suppressing the individuality of the artist, and imposing an official political function on art, while curators have been urged to accommodate more fluid, porous, and plural identity formations. For the most part, however, in the late 1980s, such doubts and criticisms were overridden, and art was deployed and frequently received as evidence of tighter, not looser, tighter visions of Japanese identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a very exciting and insightful presentation. The Tokyo Forum and Spirit and Against Nature and the Primal Spirit, and also you also talked about the Scream Against the Sky. Toward the end of his presentation, the Scream Against the Sky actually is, as you rightly mentioned, also include the reference to the Japanese American artists, and also it is in the background of the political and economic background, but still, Mimi at the Yale criticized it. So, nation-based categorization or nation-based exhibition, I think that it still is a very controversial issue triggered by that. And as you said toward the end, your last message, I think, is a very important point that all of us have to take very seriously. But later we will have a chance to discuss on this point when we have a Q&A session. So for the we would like to ask the second speaker. So Ritter Sensei, please.
I'd just like to start by thanking the Bunka-cho for organizing this multi-year-long gathering, to Kataoka-san and also to Kajiya-san for the kind invitation. Let's see. So I'll be speaking about the work of Matsui Midori. Let's see. Do you have the slide? Oh, it is on. All right. So in 2007, critic Matsui Midori curated the exhibition Door into Summer, The Age of Micropop at the Art Tower Mito. The concept of micropop, as defined by Matsui, focused on artists that utilize a childlike imagination to unlock the unrealized potential and latent beauty in banal, everyday materials and situations. Dubbed the micropop generation, these artists were born predominantly in the 1970s and came of age during Japan's prolonged economic recession in what Matsui has dubbed, quote, a culture of reduced expectations. Matsui's curatorial thesis is important for understanding the generation of artists that come after the predominantly male, this is Door into Summer, predominantly male otaku subculture inspired neopop artists such as Nara Yoshitomo, Murakami Takashi, and Yanobi Kenji, among others. While the work of the neopop generation made global inroads under Murakami Takashi's Superflat banner, touring major contemporary art institutions in Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Seattle, Paris, and New York, Matsui's Door into Summer exhibition never traveled. Instead, in 2009, Matsui and the Japan Foundation organized a follow-up exhibition, Winter Garden, the exploration of the micropop imagination in contemporary Japanese art, which debuted at the Hara Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo, and then proceeded to an astounding 44 international venues over a period of 10 years. This presentation examines the evolution of Matsui's Winter Garden, the curatorial framework used to introduce the micropop generation to a global audience, the practical concerns and limitations of traveling an exhibition so widely, and the reception of the show internationally. The exhibition Door into Summer, The Age of Micropop, was held at the Art Tower Mito from February 3rd to May 6, 2007, and was organized by the Mito Art Foundation and sponsored by Asahi Breweries, Shiseido, and Jeans Factory. Curated by the well-known art critic Matsui Midori, the ambitious exhibition consisted of over 100 works by 15 artists. Other than Nara Yoshitomo, born in 1959, who Matsui viewed as a foundational, kind of transitional father figure for the micropop generation, all of the artists featured in Door into Summer were born in the late 1960s and 1970s. So what is micropop? In the opening pages of the exhibition catalog, Matsui lays out her micropop manifesto, stating that, quote, micropop is first and foremost an attitude, not a cohesive style, of those who invent, independent of any major ideology or theory, a unique aesthetic code or behavior by reorganizing fragments that have been accumulated from diverse communicative processes, end quote. She goes on to state that micropop, quote, signifies the creativity of those who have a minor relationship to major culture, forced to operate within a frequently oppressive, dominant culture, and equipped with insufficient means. Such individuals compensate for their relative social obscurity and economic disadvantages with the free play of imagination, making do with whatever is at hand, end quote. On a theoretical level, these tendencies are informed by Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's theory of, quote, minor literature, and Michel de Certeau's writing on the practices of everyday life, which are somewhat outside the scope of today's presentation. However, put in simplified terms, Matsui saw the theoretical basis for Japan's micropop generation residing in two core impulses: deterritorialization and reuse. The first refers to individuals or artists creating their own personal language of expression by distorting or reconfiguring aspects of the dominant culture in which they reside with a childlike imagination. This can be seen most readily in the work of Aoki Ryoko and Ochiai Tam, seen here, both of whom create whimsical works rooted in personalized drawing practices that utilize free association to juxtapose elements pulled from disparate sources. The second impulse focuses on the use of banal or outmoded objects found readily in one's environment to invent new games or situations that allow the artist to find hidden meaning in daily life and or make the best of their marginalized status within society. This approach is evident in the work of artists Tanaka Koki and Izumi Taro, both of whom use video and do-it-yourself aesthetics to either find beauty or meaning in the patterns of daily life or vent their frustrations with its oppressiveness. On a sociological level, Matsui also defined the micropop generation as, quote, having developed their unique attitudes and practices in response to the conditions of Japanese society at the turn of the 21st century, end quote. According to Matsui, this generation of artists came of age during the prolonged recession of the 1990s post-bubble economy's collapse and were confronted with a series of natural and social disasters including the Great Hanshin earthquake in Kobe and the Tokyo subway sarin gas attacks of the Aum religious cult, both in 1995. Matsui points to these formative experiences as a way to explain why, quote, micropop artists are interested less in the pursuit of material gain or fame than in discovering unique ways of living with the uncertainties of the phenomenal world, end quote. Moving from the social and theoretical framework that informs the Micropop Manifesto to the exhibition itself and its impact more broadly, Door into Summer, The Age of Micropop, was a seminal curatorial project that provided much needed context for making sense of the disparate practices of the post-neopop generation of contemporary Japanese art. While other domestic exhibitions such as Roppongi Crossing in 2004 and 2007 at the Mori Art Museum, Life in 2006 at the Art Tower Mito, the Mott Annual in 2008, and the exhibition Incidental Affairs in 2009 at the Suntory Museum, each attempted in various ways to introduce artists or sensibilities that could be grouped under the Micropop umbrella, Matsui's curatorial vision remains the most comprehensive and convincing articulation of the post-neopop zeitgeist of Japanese art in the 2000s. As an exhibition, thanks to Matsui's sweeping curatorial vision and site support from Art Tower Mito's senior curator at the time, Mori Tsukasa, the exhibition was ambitious and expansive, if not overwhelming at times. And while Door into Summer's bilingual catalog circulated widely as a reference for art historians, curators, and artists, sadly, the exhibition never traveled beyond Mito. While there are a myriad of reasons why exhibitions never travel internationally, difficulty securing loans, shipping costs, lack of institutional support, and difficulty finding touring partners, one reason Door into Summer did not travel internationally may be due to the widespread art world saturation of Murakami Takashi's super flat trilogy during this time. Between 2000 and 2005, Murakami's curated exhibition projects that laid out his own Superflat manifesto and traveled internationally to LA MoCA, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, first as the Superflat exhibition, seen here, and then as the Coloriage exhibition at the Cartier Foundation in Paris in 2002, and finally to New York's Japan Society in 2005 as the exhibition Little Boy. In addition, Murakami himself had at least 4 large-scale international museum solo shows between 2001 and 2007 in Paris, London, Los Angeles, and Boston, which may have oversaturated foreign institutional appetites for touring shows of contemporary Japanese art in the lead-up to Matsui's Door into Summer. As a kind of side note, in 2008, seeing the need for a counterpoint to Murakami's super flat vision of contemporary Japanese art, I organized the exhibition Tokyo Nonsense at an independent nonprofit art space in Los Angeles called Scion Space. This was bankrolled by Toyota, actually. Inspired in part by Matsui's fresh take on the micropop generation. My exhibition, while modest and intentionally provocative, focused on a group of artists based in Tokyo, many of whom had studied under Aida Makoto. This curatorial project would later evolve into the conceptual basis for my contribution to Roppongi Crossing 2013, Out of Doubt, at the Mori Art Museum, co-curated by myself, Kataoka Mami, and Ruben Keehan, all of whom are here today, which explored the concept of nonsensu as a means of challenging the status quo. And this was the entry into that exhibition. 2 years after Door into Summer opened at Art Tower Mito, Matsui Midori curated the follow-up exhibition, Winter Garden, the exploration of the micropop imagination in contemporary Japanese art, organized by the Japan Foundation. Unlike Door into Summer, which was a standalone exhibition with multiple lenders and sponsored by major corporations, Winter Garden was envisioned and planned from the ground up as a touring exhibition under the Japan Foundation's traveling exhibition program. And here you see a page from that exhibition program laying out sort of all of the details or requirements of this traveling show. The show debuted domestically at the Hara Art Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo in May 2009, and then proceeded to travel to 44 international venues. Sorry, it's hard to put 44 venues on one slide. Over the next 10 years. Consisting of 35 works by 14 artists, all works in Winter Garden were borrowed directly from the Japan Foundation's own collection, thus eliminating the need for complex loan negotiations and paving the way for the exhibition to travel extensively without issue. This format of traveling exhibitions turns out to be quite common for the Japan Foundation, as they explain in their traveling exhibition catalog, and this is a kind of extended quote from that catalog. There are always about 15 exhibitions being held globally. The exhibition destinations extend to all over the world, including regions where there are still few opportunities to experience Japanese art and culture. The venues include not only museums and university galleries, but also multi-purpose spaces, event halls, and other locations. On average, the exhibitions are held in 3 to 6 cities per year and continuously travel for between 5 and 15 years. In order to adapt to the varying exhibition environments and realize traveling over the long term, the travel exhibitions are basically composed entirely of works from the Foundation's collection. They are a compact scale with a floor space of about 100 to 400 square meters. So that's the quote. While this model streamlines the exhibition-making process and connects the show to a built-in network of participating tour venues, it also has its drawbacks. Since the Japan Foundation must acquire the work in order to travel the show widely, this undoubtedly places financial restrictions on the works that can be purchased and, by extension, considered by the curator for inclusion. Additionally, size and quantity of works likely undergo greater scrutiny, as shows under the Japan Foundation's traveling exhibition program are explicitly marketed as having a compact scale necessary to accommodate the wide variety of exhibition venues. Lastly, the wear and tear on the artworks themselves is a serious consideration when continuously traveling an exhibition for between 5 and 15 years. In the case of Winter Garden, the work of more established figures like Nara Yoshitomo, Shimabuku, and Noguchi Rika were replaced in favor of emerging artists such as Chiba Masaya, Chimpomu, Kudo Makiko, among others. And while this may have been due to the financial limitations of the Japan Foundation traveling exhibition format, to her credit, Matsui updated the exhibition's curatorial thesis to accommodate not only a younger group of artists, but take into account recent developments in the ensuing 2 years between Door into Summer and Winter Garden. While somewhat tenuous, Matsui's updated thesis argued there was a shift in focus of the micropop imagination between the two exhibitions, from the reorganization of information and reuse of everyday items as a means to attain individual agency and or freedom, to a practice of maintaining that agency and freedom that was now contingent on human relations and contact with other bodies. Matsui's evidence for this shift was ambiguous and hard to pinpoint, but she ultimately concluded that, quote, Winter Garden attempts to explore the efforts of contemporary artists to make the most of the poverty and boredom inflicted by contemporary life in order to reorganize various aspects of their everyday activities and reinvent effective ways of operating, end quote. Unlike Door into Summer, which presented the micropop sensibility as it appeared in each individual artist's practice, an artist-by-artist approach to structuring the exhibition, for Winter Garden, Matsui chose to organize the exhibition into 3 distinct thematic categories. Category 1 dealt with works that utilized the unconscious mind to create free associations that defy rational order. Category 2 consisted of works that employ international myths born out of contemporary Japanese subculture. And category 3 featured works that simulate the self-generating structure of plants, animals, and minerals to convey the physical and psychological effects of external phenomena. Category 1 included familiar micropop artists Aoki Ryoko, Tam Ochiai or Ochiai Tam, Tanaka Koki, Sugito Hiroshi, and Yagi Ryota. Artists representative of category 2 included Takano Aya, Kudo Makiko, Kunikata Mahomi, Izumi Taro, and Chimpom. Chimpom's inclusion here in a section related to Japanese subculture was oddly out of place and incongruous, as their provocative, socially engaged work is primarily rooted in a critique of mainstream Japanese society. Matsui's reading of their video work, seen here, Feeling Like the Guys Make Me Hot 01 from 2008, which was the group's sole work featured in Winter Garden, equally misses the mark by interpreting it as a childlike act of fun, when its frenzied tone is more reflective of a band of pyromaniacs reveling in the nihilistic beauty of destruction. The third and final category featured work by Handa Masanori, Saeki Hiroe, Chiba Masaya, and Yamamoto Keisuke. Turning our attention to the exhibition's international reception, based on 10 reviews from exhibition venues as varied as Canberra, Australia, Hong Kong, Cairo, Hanoi, and Haifa, the response to Winter Garden was overwhelmingly positive. One reviewer in Hong Kong described it as, quote, a surprisingly relevant exhibition, while another reviewer in Hanoi stated it was, quote, an excellent exhibition and one of immense importance to the local student and emerging artists who don't get enough chances to see a bit of cutting-edge art by their overseas counterparts, end quote. Probably the most thoughtful review came from critic Jess Oliver, writing about the 2014 presentation at the M16 Art Space in Canberra, Australia, who stated, quote, overall, Winter Garden is a successful and fascinating insight into the artistic phenomena of micropop. The conceptual framework developed by Midori Matsui successfully articulates the connectedness and disparity between the practices of artists operating within a society recovering from social, economic, and environmental disaster, end quote. However, some reviewers dismissed the exhibition as, quote, childish or boring, while more critical reviewers commented on the challenging nature of the exhibition, including Art Asia Pacific's Sylvia Tsai, who criticized Matsui's three-point micropop theory as being, quote, convoluted and difficult to navigate, end quote. Compared to Matsui's initial micropop curation at Art Tower Mito, Winter Garden was modest in scale and likely required some curatorial concessions in order to adjust her original thesis and checklist to the demands of the Japan Foundation's traveling exhibition program. That being said, thanks to its extensive tour, Winter Garden was undoubtedly responsible for introducing the micropop generation of artists to a wider and more diverse viewing audience than Mito's Door into Summer could have ever hoped to achieve. As a curator having worked closely with the Japan Foundation to organize multiple exhibitions in the past, I'm intimately aware of the many institutional obstacles museums face when trying to realize a single exhibition of contemporary Japanese art abroad, let alone an internationally touring exhibition that traveled to 44 venues. Despite any curatorial concessions that may have been made, Winter Garden was an impressive feat by most institutional metrics, and when considered together with Door into Summer, has greatly enriched the world's understanding of contemporary Japanese art over the past decade. While traveling exhibitions of this size and scale do not receive the same recognition and critical acclaim from major art world press outlets or the attendance figures as their blockbuster counterparts, in the case of Winter Garden, appealing to a, quote, minor audience on a global scale seems a fitting curatorial model worthy of the micropop generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel Ritter. It was a very interesting presentation. As you mentioned, Micropop is a critical exhibition in the year 2000. Well, the artists from those new era has been included and embraced. And without making a overseas trip, we also had this internal mobile exhibition. And as mentioned, there has been 44 exhibitions over a period of 10 years' time. in terms of this Winter Garden, and the way that it has been held and organized is also interesting. And Gabriel, in your presentation, you also mentioned that Murakami Takashi and other super flag exhibitions were being held at the same time, right? So in relation to that, perhaps the Micropop exhibit did not roll over. At the same time, if we think of the demand of the Japanese modern art at the time, the concept of this Micropop, well, I should say the artists that are categorized in Micropop is, well, how did they become well known? That's something that is worthwhile studying. Well, actually, I have a set of questions, but let me save that for the Q&A session. So we would like to move on to the third presenter.
And that is going to be JC Fox. Hello, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for your introduction. My name is Foxwell. It's my great pleasure.
Happy to be here. Very, very grateful to be able to be at this event and part of this panel. And I would just like to reiterate the thanks for the organizers, the Bunka-cho, Katoka-san and Kajiya-san for inviting us, as well as to the interpreters. As Kajiya-san said, the panel today in my talk is focusing on exhibitions in the United States. And I believe there are many important differences if we're to look with a comparison with Europe. In my own research, I think that the situation in Europe, perhaps Australia, is different. So I just want to say that what I'm saying right now, it reflects my research on the United States because I live there, and possibly just one trend out of many. Okay, so among art enthusiasts or Japanese art specialists in the United States, I've often heard opinions that contemporary Japanese art they encounter in museums is disappointingly limited in scope. According to this opinion, the image of contemporary Japanese art in the United States has been overwhelmed by one type of art, so-called popular art, including neopop, and I'm not sure yet how it relates to what Gabriel Ritter talked about in terms of micropop. Maybe it could be oops, this is different. Anyway, that this is a kind of image among the general public of what contemporary Japanese art is. And as early as the year 2000, the art critic Robert C. Morgan opened his review of the works of non-pop artist, the minimalist artist Koyama Tadaaki, with the lines, "It is refreshing to know that there are artists today who are not seduced by the allure of popular culture and who are willing to step back from the banalities of everyday life and see art in its own terms." While Morgan didn't say that Japanese artists in particular had trouble stepping back from pop culture, his comment about Koyama is prescient of the way in which Japanese popular culture would come to dominate the average person's image of contemporary Japanese art over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, with Murakami Takashi as the primary representative. In the final chapter of her book, Umi o Wataru Nihon Gendai Bijutsu, Mitsuyama Kyoko describes a similar situation, as does Adrian Favell, who stated, "Japanese contemporary art since 2000 has been mostly represented internationally by Murakami and artists associated with his style." In 2012, the curator David Elliott expressed a relatable desire to move beyond these certain pop artists in order to showcase what he highlighted as, quote, "the many different and more explicitly critical approaches to art making that he found in Japan." My personal perception conforms to these sources, namely that American museums might find it hard to diversify their special exhibitions of Japanese post-war and contemporary art. A curator at a major American institution whom I interviewed for this project said that they are currently at work on yet another Murakami Takashi exhibition on encouragement from their museum director, who wants to appeal to younger audiences, while another curator was arranging a team lab exhibition with a similar aim of attracting new museum goers with fun and user-friendly content. The works of Murakami, Team Lab, and other artists in Japanese popular culture and subculture traditions make important contributions to global contemporary art. Even so, because their work builds on cultural commodities that were designed to make money by appealing to broad audiences, they risk eclipsing other art that is more challenging or places further emotional and perceptual demands on the viewer. My colleague at the University of Chicago, Matthew Jesse Jackson, says that the art market will inevitably favor works that are flashy and easy to understand. Within that inevitability, he highlights the role that scholars and curators play in disseminating and adding content that might otherwise escape our notice. I conceived today's talk out of a long-standing desire to promote growth and diversity. To return to the case of the minimalist Koyama Tadaaki, with which I opened, when in the United States museums recently have we seen a large exhibition devoted to Koyama or to Naitore or Shiota Chiharu or other artists who do not fit within this dominant image, popular cultural image? My talk today takes the following structure. First, I'd like to quickly confirm my terms in use. Next, I'll introduce some data that I gathered in order to interrogate my premise of a lack of diversity. Third, I'll suggest that structural forces and not the inherent preferences of American viewers or museum leadership are largely responsible for these trends. The structural forces are of two types: historical, dating back to the age of Orientalism and Japonism, and contemporary. And finally, I'll offer some conclusions. Overall, average viewers in the US, I suggest, have a positive image of contemporary Japanese art as fun, approachable, and youthful. Historically, much high art had been predicated on establishing a lofty environment of detached contemplation that left some viewers feeling isolated and excluded. And American museums today are trying to do a better job including people who may not previously have felt comfortable even setting foot in a museum. And Japanese art is seen to be approachable along these lines. By contrast, some contemporary Japanese art's easy relationship with popular culture and consumerism leaves viewers at ease to regard skateboard decks by Murakami and other artists for sale in the gift shop with the same eyes that they use to take in his large murals and sculptures in the adjacent gallery. The Japanese art that appears dominant today contains all or some of the following characteristics: proximity to the commercial and everyday, frankness about the realities of economics and marketing, lighthearted, irreverent, and fun, and or dark, grotesque, sexualized, and occult, incorporating motifs from Japanese popular culture, and tending not to place deep ethical or critical demands on the viewer or to require deep concentration. And it rearranges or revives sometimes traditional Japanese aesthetics, especially in a fun and self-conscious way. So having proposed these characteristics of a dominant American image of contemporary Japanese art, I'd like to move on to the results of my survey. In order to test my assumptions about whether this was dominant in practice in American museums, I endeavored to gather some data. So my data research took two forms. First, I conducted interviews with several Japanese art curators at major US museums. Second, I generated a list of exhibitions of post-war and contemporary Japanese art in US museums and nonprofit art spaces between 2011 and the present day. This is a portion. And I'm immensely grateful to Torres Shi, my undergraduate research assistant at the University of Chicago, for working rapidly to compile this list, which I then enhanced. Without him, my talk today truly would not have been possible. I'm also grateful to Leah Robinson at the Shigeko Kubota Foundation and Japanese Art Society of America for her valuable input, as well as numerous colleagues. And I invite anyone to please take a look at this and give me further input. So looking only at museums or non-commercial spaces, Torres and I were able to list around 125 exhibitions of post-war and contemporary Japanese art between 2011 and 2022. There are many different ways we can interpret this data. For example, among the 125 examples, I counted about 16 solo exhibitions for women artists, and one group exhibition devoted explicitly to women, female ceramicists. I next attempted to divide the results by medium, which is not the perfect strategy. So this, if you count this, it doesn't quite add up because there's also some other categories here I didn't include. But generally, for ceramics, bamboo, and lacquer, about 19 exhibitions. Prints, about 17. Japanese style painting, Japanese pop, and works about Japan, Japanese culture, including Murakami, around 17. Photography, I think up to 19 now. Video and moving image, 12. Gutai and post-war avant-garde, 9. Installation, including kusama, yayoi, about 8. Textiles and fashion, 5. Architecture, 4. Graphic design, painting, and posters, 7. Ono Yoko, I gave her own category. She had 2. Performance, 3. Monoha, 2. Calligraphy, 2. So the artists who stood out for having their own retrospectives were Murakami Takashi. I counted about 2 solo and 4 group exhibitions. Kusama Yayoi, 4 solo exhibitions and installations. Ono Yoko, 2 solo exhibitions. So it was quite difficult to analyze the exhibitions by medium. Some artists, such as Ono Yoko and Kusama Yayoi, have had long careers involving a wide range of materials and intersections with other artists. Some exhibitions were not limited to a particular medium. The black and white exhibition at the MFA Boston, for example, included prints, ceramics, and calligraphy. Liu Fan was a major theorist of Japan-based monoha, but ultimately I didn't include his 2011 retrospective at the Guggenheim or 2019 installation at the Hirshhorn Museum because I didn't know if he should fit within a list of Japanese artists. Another limitation is medium. And finally, you could say that the most limiting part of my survey was to exclude commercial galleries. When Mika Yoshitake held the Requiem for the Sun exhibition at Blum & Poe, complete with a large and important catalog, it constituted a majorly artistic and scholarly enterprise that was noted throughout the entire field. Still, given these various limitations, what does this data reveal? First, although they might take up vastly less room and lack large public relations campaigns, 20th and 21st century prints and ceramics were the most frequent representatives, together with photography, of modern and contemporary Japanese art in US museums in the past decades. Next, around 17 entries was work that could be called Japanese style, including Nihonga, which was my original specialization, a research specialization, Japanese pop, and group exhibitions such as Bye Bye Kitty. This latter exhibition featured works that reflect or comment on Japanese culture and society as its main theme, perhaps the continuation of the trend that Bert Sensei already talked about. The latter exhibition, photography and video art made a very good showing, and if we combine these into 2, we actually get 31 entries, making it the largest category and reflecting the overall perception of video art, photography, and architecture as among the most noteworthy subfields of artistic activity within Japan today. Exhibitions of Murakami, Kusama, Nihonga, such as Senju Hiroshi, and other neo-pop or neo-traditional artists were indeed numerous in the past decade, but so were photography, time-based medium, installation, and post-war gutai and conceptual art. Outside of all these familiar contemporary art categories, we can also see a surprisingly strong presence for prints and ceramics, and to a lesser extent, other craft practices such as bamboo and lacquer. What photography, prints, time-based media, and ceramics all have in common, surprisingly, is that each enjoys a designated department and location within the American museums for exhibition and display. To take the Art Institute of Chicago, for example, film, video, and photography each have their own spaces and specialists within the museum, while Japanese ceramics and prints have designated galleries and casework in the Japanese section. These works, in other words, do not require the curators to reserve the special exhibition galleries to be shown. By contrast to the strong presence of contemporary Japanese ceramics in many American museums, or including Art Institute, Mishima Kimio's sculptural ceramic work, also in the Art Institute, was never shown, I don't think, or even photographed. This was given to the museum by a donor in the 90s, and there was another donor who gave Mishima Kimio's collage from the 60s, but we may have to wait a long time to see such works actually in the galleries. They're virtually unknown even to specialists like myself. Because contemporary art curators' specializations cover many mediums spread out from post-war to the present and across every part of the globe, we may have to wait a long time to see these works in the galleries. If Japanese post-war and contemporary art has enjoyed greater visibility in photography, video, and film, it may be because the curators in those areas have a tighter range of focus, and because Japanese artists' contributions to a medium-specific artistic discourse may be easier to appreciate and contextualize across the collection. The same can be true of architecture and contemporary ceramics, where the foremost Japanese examples are by nature situated within a worldwide medium-specific dialogue. These ceramicists, film, video artists, and curators the world over share a technical language, framework, and history of the medium. So even curators not well-versed in the overall history of modern Japanese art can be confident advocates for such works today, even if they don't speak Japanese, because the language of medium allows any architectural specialist, for example, to explain the works of Ando Tadao, or non-Japanese language speaking photography curator to vividly and confidently introduce Japanese photography of the 1960s. This brings me to the next topic. Exhibitions which incorporate post-war and contemporary Japanese works, or even pre-war Japanese modernist works as part of a larger trans-regional theme. So these types of exhibitions can be a little bit harder to discover by research because they're not Japan focused, but that's exactly why they're important, right? As we saw in the previous two presenters' talks. In fall 2021, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Tate Modern hosted Global Surrealism to great acclaim with an important Japanese loan, Koga Harue's The Sea of 1929, even serving as the main image of the glowing New Yorker article by veteran critic Peter Sheldal. So I know this is not post-war and contemporary art, but it's example of incorporation of an important work in Japan into a global framework of modernism. The global reach of this exhibition built on earlier successes of exhibitions representing Dada and Surrealism as truly global movements. For example, the 2012 exhibition Drawing Surrealism at the LA County Museum of Art, LACMA, included works by Japanese artists Eikyu and Aimitsu, in part thanks to the advocacy of specialists in Japanese art. So the way it was told to me is that this Drawing Surrealism exhibition was being organized mostly around Western art, And then Japan specialists said, oh, there's actually some Japanese works we can include in this. And so the collaboration became organic. And then from there, it made specialists in surrealism or Dada understand, okay, these movements have works in Japan that we can also draw on for future exhibitions. An exhibition about to open at my own university museum, or just opened last night, I think, Monochrome Multitudes, examines the monochrome. This is another theme that we saw yesterday as well in the M+, maybe, I think, in global, modern, and contemporary art, and invited specialists in each field to write the wall texts for works in their area of expertise. This exhibition incorporates works by Koyama, Sugimoto Hiroshi, Liu Fan, and Theaster Gates, among many others. It acknowledges the fact that if you want to be a truly inclusive in a trans-regional exhibition, you can't only include diverse works, you need to also have diverse specialists, diverse voices who are interpreting the work, right? Because if, like we saw with the previous speakers, if only one curator is interpreting all the works regardless of their specialty, some context might be missed. So this inclusive curatorial strategy can serve as a corrective to earlier, for example, the 2016 reinstallation of the contemporary art galleries at the Art Institute of Chicago, where the critic Laurie Waxman pointed out the insufficiency of the strategy of simply including a few poorly contextualized works by Brazilian modernism and Japanese Gutai among permanent collection galleries that remained dominated by large works by mostly white male artists. This leads to the collection of museum hiring. Until recently, the coveted position of curator of modern and contemporary art in the United States museums almost always went to a specialist in Western European and American art. Such curators often claimed a lack of expertise as the reason for continuing to include non-Western works, continuing to exclude non-Western works from their supposedly encyclopedic gallery displays. Today, however, many museums in the US are making a conscious effort to diversify their staff, both in terms of background and geographical expertise. Thus, the leadership at the Dallas Museum of Art has been making a conscious effort to recruit modern contemporary curators whose main area of expertise is in a geographic area outside of Europe and America, such as Brazil, East Asia, India, or Latin America. The expectation is that such curators would make studio visits and buy works in the US by American artists, but they would also cover one area outside of the US that they specialize in, and that they would collaborate with each other to make connections. However, not all major museums are currently so proactive. In my interviews that I conducted, multiple curators indicated museum leadership's lack of support as a crucial impediment. This reminds us that the data I collected does not show, of course, exhibitions that curators conceived and proposed, but which unfortunately did not come to fruition. In talking to curators over the years, I've come to see that such exhibitions that never happened were quite numerous. And in my next and final section, therefore, I'd like to contemplate the contemporary and historical impediments that artists and curators continue to face. In my curator interviews, I specifically asked about the supports and impediments to exhibiting post-war and contemporary Japanese art. In the interest of time, I'm simply going to report some of the responses that I received. Curators' responsibilities often cover the entire history of Japanese or Asian art, and they say they don't have much time to learn about artists working in Japan today. Further, the museum director's office will often not approve travel so that the curators can go to Japan to network with artists, collectors, curators, and dealers there and to see art that's being made today. So they say it's difficult to get to know new artists. And this curators, one curator mentioned they're actually very grateful to scholars such as Katoka Mami-san, who could act as a conduit, introducing artists and their works to English-speaking audiences. Collectors based in the US, they said, are crucial to being able to mount exhibitions of post-war and contemporary art. You need to have a source to borrow the works locally rather than always have to pay for international exhibitions. And collectors, in turn, are introduced to the field by certain dealers who, quote, really know how to build a clientele and get people hooked, end quote, on art and artists that the collectors might not have heard of before. With the above comments, curators outlined an ecosystem of support that was necessary for contemporary art to flourish, and which was frequently inadequate or depleted in the curator's area. Another curator explained that it was a matter of reinforcement from many different sources to create excitement and curiosity about an artist. So two curators had almost identical statements about the importance of dealers, certain dealers, in generating interest and educating and encouraging collectors. These collectors then work with the museums to provide support for exhibition and collecting. Big exhibitions such as the Guggenheim's Gutai Splendid Playground, in the words of a curator, caused many hitherto unknown works to resurface, some of which were acquired by museums such as the Art Institute of Chicago. Exhibitions and academic articles, said the curator, are themselves not enough to generate momentum alone. Excitement can only be sustained if there is a source to get this and see and buy maybe the actual works. These comments accord with what Dr. Tomi Reiko recently introduced in this Art Platform Japan and other fora as the Sami Itai no Kino, the three interlocking elements, or the trinity, she says, of academic study, museum collecting, and market forces. In comparing the list of exhibitions that took place in the US with comments from curators and scholars, I believe that it would be a mistake to see current exhibitionary or market trends as the conscious result of American viewers or curators' preferences. Rather, we must take a systems-based approach to appreciating why certain artists or types of art become so prominent. And similarly, I recommend that we also take a systems or art ecosystem-based approach if we want to affect change. I think actually this relates to what Gabriel Ritter was just saying. The last point I'd like to make is that the historical system and the collections that museums inherited in the US is unfortunately one that was historically flawed by older bias and generations of Orientalism. So in my concluding section, I'd like to return to reflect on the so-called origin point of something known as contemporary art. One recent trend in art history has involved a rethinking of how we speak about time itself, and how reconceptions of time can lead to changes in how we see and value the work of art. And this time is really interesting. If we reflect on the exhibitions we've seen today, we saw a tendency to either locate Japanese art as primordial, in other words, in a pre-moment, or hyper postmodern, like in a post moment, like as if there's a kind of Western anxiety, like Japan cannot be over us, so we need to put it either zurasu, you have to put it either before or after. And so I think this trend of thinking about how time itself is actually malleable and there's different possibilities for narrating and thinking about time can be a useful strategy. These authors, Alexander Nagel and Christopher Wood, invigorated the field with what they called Renaissance anachronism in a wide-ranging discussion that included Japan's Ise Jingu even, which is like simultaneously old and new. They underscored that people in other times and places likely had a remarkably different understanding of time, temporality, sacrality, and authenticity than we do in the modern era. They proceeded to show how altering our understanding of time could in turn change how we evaluate certain medieval or Renaissance artworks that had previously been negatively appraised as forgeries, replicas, or anachronisms. Now, what would happen if we applied this idea to global contemporary art? In his book, Visual Time, Keith Moxey does just this by embracing a notion of time as regional and multiple. And Keith Moxey himself was born in Argentina. Doing this multiple time allowed Moxie to counteract the hegemonic, modernist, and colonialist project by which the West sought to, quote, control the rest of the globe's cultures by subordinating them to its own telos, its own timeline. Modernism, writes Moxie, finds it necessary to believe that time is going somewhere, perhaps even that it has an end. It cannot accept that there might be more than one shape of time, for its global dominance depends on the negation of any alternative, end quote. Relatedly, in her well-known article on historicizing Gendai Bijutsu, Tomi Reiko points out that another meaning of contemporary is occurring at the same time, right? Dojise. What is valuable about this insight is that when two things are occurring at the same time, there's no center and periphery. There's a fabric of time, and each person is embedded within the time and looking at each other from within the same moment. Through this idea of a shared temporal fabric, we can escape this earlier very limiting perspective in which Japanese artists were dismissed as belated or derivative examples of certain Western masters. But there's a problem with this idealistic view of time. As we know from astronomy, space and time are two sides of the same coin, fused into a four-dimensional continuum. That's still a slippery concept for us. Contemporaneity, or inhabiting the same temporality, only becomes possible when infrastructure, horsepower, and technology allowed people from vastly different regions to traverse space, shrink the globe, and establish some grounds for communication. However, the control of those resources and technologies was always profoundly unbalanced. In Japan, it was only in the Meiji era that Japanese politicians, intellectuals, or artists felt that they had a chance, not a fair or equal chance, but still a chance to have a bidirectional or multi-directional real-time exchange between themselves and what they called the Western countries, which had already forced them into the unequal treaties. During this time, as Sato Doshin and others have pointed out, Japanese politicians and entrepreneurs assiduously researched European and American preferences in Japanese art. And in fact, in the Meiji Tens, the 1880s, there was a Ryuchikai, the Dragon Pond Society, which was a public-private partnership of officials, art dealers, artists, whose very job was to try to research what is it that Americans and Europeans wanted out of Japanese art in the 1880s. And they thought, if we can figure out what they want, we can make it, we can sell it, and we can make money. However, in my opinion, this Meiji art market research could never be successful, or not 100% successful, because most European and American collectors, such as the painter John Lafarge or the French collector Louis Gons, didn't want to connect with living Japanese artists, right? They wanted the old Japan. They wanted the antiques, and they wanted to access the Japan which was not aware of the Western influence, right? So this was, to me, the structure of Japonisme, which was very similar to gendered voyeurism, in which the West wanted to be able to objectify old Japan while avoiding the active, challenging gaze and artworks of present-day Japan. But Japanese artists didn't give up. They continued actively engaging with the Euro-American art system. In the late Meiji period, after the year 1900, a new generation of Meiji artists sought to inhabit the same temporality as their Western counterparts by traveling to Europe and the United States. Oil painters, watercolorists, Nihonga painters, and printmakers all made this journey despite the fact that Japan's economy was far from synchronized with the global economy. The Americans and Europeans who purchased the works of Taikon, Nakagawa Hachiro, Mitsutani Kunishiro, or Yoshida Hiroshi were buying contemporary Japanese art back in the year 1900. And in some cases, most famously with the young Taikon and Hishida Shunso, these artists found more support for their works initially abroad than they did in Japan, where their styles were initially considered too radical. My point is that whether they studied hard to ascertain and satisfy foreign preferences, or whether they made art in their own way and were fortunate to be accepted by foreign collectors, the temporal, cultural, and economic gap between Japanese makers and foreign audiences, and which was not just a gap but an inequality, remained a barrier to contemporaneity as such, to inhabiting the truly same time and having a deep conversation. So today, some of Japan's most notable contemporary art, I think, is significant that it's actually site-based work that requires us to go to the site and engage with it there. As we can see from both Japanese and foreign artists' work at the current Aichi Triennale as well. So we realize that space-time is not completely fluid. We can't just be anywhere and understand, access everything, but it takes work to go, and maybe our understanding will always be kind of incomplete and subjective. Then it may help to explain why there are a lot of works these days that emphasize the fragility of communication and understanding, such as Theaster Gates' so-called Afro-Minge arts, or Mori Yuko's 2017 and 2020 works I Can't Hear You, which is also profiled on Art Platform Japan and took on added meaning during the pandemic at the Sao Paulo Biennale. Today, we're grateful once again have the opportunity to share the same space-time, however fragile and risky those attempted connections may be. When we accept that time is multiple, communication is never complete, and each new encounter is a serendipitous gift, we are in a good mindset to appreciate why contemporary art is so alluring to audiences today, including young people in an era of global homogenization and seemingly instantaneous virtual connectivity. Where does this leave us with respect to the future of exhibiting contemporary Japanese art? In Cynic in the Playground, a documentary about Aida Makoto, the final scene has the camera trained on Aida's small atelier, where the artist is about to make a new painting. Aida reflects that he paints all sorts of things, but that pictures of girls sell the best. He pauses, shrugs, and decides to paint another picture of a girl. Aida's ironical image of himself as a sellout to market forces alerts us to a lack of support for art and artists, just as seen in Ozawa Tsuyoshi's famous performance work about the Nasubi Gallery, in which the artist is forced to display miniatures of his own art on his back since he can't afford to exhibit in a gallery. Museums are research institutions with enormous ability to shape the present and the future of contemporary Japanese art, but we increasingly hear how they face their own financial challenges in the 21st century. I believe that we can work together to find creative and cost-effective ways to create a healthy and diverse ecosystem for contemporary art worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. It was a very interesting, the presentation. Ms. Foxwell actually interviewed the curators, and they heard their, the voices. The department of the museums and the exhibition, the relation is interesting. The specific space or the physical space is designated for the certain types of the work like ceramics or the video and the photos. So they account for the major part of the exhibition. Speaking of the Japanese contemporary art, and also the specific medias among the professionals or the medium-specific dialogue. What's the words? I think can be utilized. That also is another point of interest. And Ms. Foxwell, they also researched the Japanese, the paintings of the images in the Meiji era. The finding is interesting. And your last part about the temporality and the time's diversity and the regionality, you developed that, the discussion from the Marxist, the discussion, and I would like to share the opinions later in the discussion. Thank you very much. So far, we've spent about 2 hours and heard, the 3 presentations. Now we'll have a short break currently.
Bert-san. So we would like to kick off the discussion. First of all, from my end, I would like to give some comments and also raise some questions to the three presenters. Starting from Bert's presentation, I really found that interesting. And for the Tokyo exhibit, I also made a research and I also made some presentations in the past. And against nature and all the other exhibits of the time of Japanese contemporary art has been, and the primal spirit as well. I have also listened to your presentation from that perspective. And when we think of against nature, yes, it did make some criticism against Japanism, but at the same time, the curator's conversation has kind of implicated the identity towards Japanism, and the aspect of Japan had been focused, and the primal spirit is something that we got some resistance, and the Japanese feature and attributes were being criticized. And then comes the favela of Brazil. But then that was then later criticized by Canada, in Canada. So criticism followed by criticism. And when we think about something very Japanese or uniqueness, and to make that relatively evaluating, so let me change the way of asking. When we think of Japanese culture and the Bunka-cho, which is the government office covering the development of Japanese art, well then, when we want people outside Japan to get to know more about Japanese art, what can we do? In that case, Bert-san has been also raising a problem at the end towards his presentation, as Fumio Nanjo says. Yet, the reality in Japan can be communicated, and as long as we do have art, that should be continued. That's another way of thinking. So this kind of Japanese attributes being converted in that way, or the nation-based existing, is something I would like to raise, and I would like to have some comments from you on this topic.
Thank you very much for that question. I felt my own position with regard to the exhibition of Nihon Teki na Mono evolving during the course of this research, and of course during the course of my career, I suppose. So to kind of trace those two trajectories, during the 1980s, of course, Japan was so economically powerful that in that particular context, Japanese cultural nationalism often seemed a threat. But in subsequent years, in a more kind of multipolar world of globalization and perhaps the contemporary moment of, if it can be adjudicated as post-globalization, that threat doesn't seem as paramount, and there are other threats. In fact, a kind of greater sympathetic attention to Nihon Teki na Mono might well be more welcome at this particular moment, which is to say that that the presentation of Nihon Teki na Mono, or the national quotient of any culture, Chinese, American, or Brazilian, or any culture, might best be carried out with a judicious dose of humility, because it is a relative kind of property. It's a fluctuating relative kind of commodity. And another way in which my own sense of this question changed was that I realized I had a certain history with these exhibitions myself, and that a great deal of time has gone by, and that I have myself as a person who teaches Japanese art history in California, um, uh, developed a certain kind of immunity to cliched overstatements of Japanese cultural identity. And the sort of pivotal moment for me in realizing that my own point of view is not necessarily the point of view of the target audience of such exhibitions occurred when I was asked recently to do some research on relationships between Japanese contemporary art and Brazilian contemporary art for the Dallas Museum of Art in a project they're working on. And having no connections to Brazil really, and needing and thirsting for information and knowledge and artworks and so on about Brazil, I chanced upon a catalog of an exhibition curated by Hasegawa Yuko called Neotropicalia. And this catalog was really gratifying to me in ways that such exhibition catalogs for Japanese art probably never will be, because I'm inured to the excesses of the Nihonjin ron and so on. Nonetheless, there is a need for such, for maybe not for me as much, maybe for other museum goers and other publics in different parts of the world. Such exhibitions fulfill a very important role that 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 I tend to underestimate because of my own standpoint. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it dances around the very important issue of just how to negotiate the presentation of Nihon-teki na mono in these exhibitions. I've tried to identify such exhibitions as a particular genre of exhibition that I'm calling the diplomatic, nation-based exhibition of art for foreign audiences. And that, I think, is a genre that has changed a lot since the 1980s, the time when I was talking about. And to say that it has changed is not to say that it has gone away or that it will disappear anytime soon.
Thank you. Yes, time has changed drastically, but we have to continuously think and ponder on these matters. Now, let me move on to Gabriel. When we think of Micropop, the Winter Garden exhibition, when we think about this, I personally found it very interesting because Midori Matsui, well, in the past, when we think of the thesis of the previous Japanese thing, she never referred to that, but she referred to other people's thesis, and she came up with the micropop, which at the end became unique. And the one that started in 2007 in the Mito Art of Museum. And before that, in year 2000, Mito Museum, I think up to 1999 or 2000, and there was this big exhibit on Japan, a different one. And the first up to the third generation is what Matsui knew. And we had Murakawa Takashi, Ozawa Tsuyoshi, and Yutaka. And the Saiki's exhibit is in the second gen, like Aida Makoto, Yanabe Kenichi. So these are these could have been grouped as the second gen, but when comparing all the differences from the previous Japanese thesis, we found that very distinct, I should say. Yet, Matsui tried to bring in the Japanese uniqueness as a trend. And when we think of the Micropop artists of the same time, I think there were other artists in the world, not just Saraji or Tom Friedman and Elizabeth Baton. So these are probably the Micropop artists of the same time. But rather than comparing with that, you made a summary more on what was happening in Japan, I suppose. That's what Matsui was doing. So I would like to hear from you, Gabriel, your views on why Matsui did not compare that to others.
To talk with you is well, in the United States, in Los Angeles, Japanese American culture and communities, and was the venue. That was the only venue for this Winter Garden. So the Micropop generation artists, when we introduce them to the international audience, my question is whether the wind garden was really a favorable wind for them to be projected worldwide, or are there any other route or other event that made them known to the rest of the world? So those are the two questions I had for you.
Thank you for those questions, Kajiya-san. Let's see. So I'll start with your first question about Matsui sort of contextualizing the Micropop generation. Well, one, not referencing necessarily Japan's past, although she does in the manifesto and in her catalog speak to, as you were describing, the kind of first and second waves or first and second generations of contemporary Japanese art. But then she kind of hesitates to say that Winter Garden is the third generation. She sort of sees it as being an extension, but I have to think back to her argument as to why she doesn't simply state it as a third wave. She does mention a handful of non-Japanese artists as exhibiting the same sensibilities. So Elizabeth Payton is somebody who she does mention explicitly in the catalog. So there is this global understanding of what's happening in the contemporary art world at this time, but I think she takes it upon herself as her project to articulate what is I guess you say uniquely domestic shift in the art scene. And I think she is trying to articulate and also argue for a new identity and a new agency and new interests of this younger generation kind of in the 2000s, as opposed to the previous neopop generation of, say, Murakami and Nara and Ida and others. I think she also is she's trying to open up that conversation. I just mentioned it briefly, but the neopop generation is almost exclusively male. It's very much, there's a lot of machismo that's going on there. Even Chelsea, as you were describing with Ida's, interview, he's, always looking at these kind of prepubescent women. There's a kind of male centeredness to the neopop. Whereas with Micropop, and she points to these, quote, minor practices. She roots it a lot in drawing. There are also, she speaks about it being explicitly anti-commercial in that way, that these artists are not courting the market, that they are, because of societal pressures, because of where they sort of find themselves, they need to, they create their own world, this own kind of internalized sort of imagination that allows them agency or creative freedom within their own small world or small sphere. And she is keen to point out, and it's a more inclusive, I think, articulation of what was going on in Japan, and it's much more judicious in terms of men and women. And I'm trying to think in terms of, I think the other thing that's important, at least the way I've read Matsui-san's manifesto and the argument, both in Door into Summer and then in Winter Garden, is they're unlike, and this also touches on, I think, some of the expectations or the understanding of, say, American or Western audiences of Japanese art, that it's, Japanese art is not political. That was something that was one of the parts of the rubric. Yeah. Whereas Matsui's theory has a kind of micro-political dimension, which was not present in the neo-pop generation. So, to have this, oppressive sort of dominant culture kind of questioning or negating or kind of placing who you are and who your kind of agency and being are is kind of into a corner. She looks at this, Matsui looks at these theorists that are looking at similar situations, whether it be, I think she uses Kafka as an example, a number of authors who use the dominant culture or the colonizer's language to create a kind of sphere that is against the politically dominant culture. So there is a kind of political agency, while it's still micro and minor, that I think is important to point out in her theory and her thesis, that I find very appealing. And I think also provides a certain agency to this generation of artists that are seen as, just quote unquote making do, or living within this culture of reduced expectations. Even within that, there can be a personal political life that these artists have, which I find convincing and important. So that's maybe your first question. And then in terms of the second question, I never saw Door into Summer. I received the catalog soon after, or maybe almost simultaneous to its release, so it was something that I was reading and understanding this exhibition through the catalog. But I don't know actually why, but I happened to be in Japan and I saw Winter Garden at the Hara Museum, and then not so long after, I also saw it in Los Angeles. It was at a small venue called the JACCC, the Japanese American Cultural Community Center. And this space was, through my research and looking at the tour, and similar tours of the Japan Foundation touring exhibition, this is very indicative of those venues. They are not major museums. They are not university galleries, although sometimes this show went to university galleries. And oftentimes they were venues that don't court an art audience. And so, even in my paper, I say that it was a successful show based on most metrics. I don't know really who saw Winter Garden. I happened to in Los Angeles, but I know that it was a much smaller space. And, Okabe-san was very generous to provide me with some sort of partial information on data of attendance figures to this exhibition. And even though it traveled to 44 venues and was, exhibited over a decade, I'm sure it saw only a fraction of what a major, blockbuster show outside of Japan would have ever seen, maybe even at one venue. It may have only seen less than, maybe conservatively, 60,000 people over the course of a decade. Whereas, some exhibitions may see over 100,000 in 2 months at whether it be Australia, the United States, New York, or elsewhere. So you make a good point. How did this generation of artists then become known to a global audience? I think partly it is this sort of touring exhibition model, but even some of the reviewers do touch, and I should point out, in Bert's presentation, the outlets that are reviewing the three exhibitions you spoke of are the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Houston Chronicle. The reviews that I'm referencing for Winter Garden are online blogs. It's a completely different reception, different audience that is attending these exhibitions, but also then, I guess, in some sense, contextualizing, historicizing, criticizing them. It exists in and of itself a kind of minor mode. But some of those reviews, it's interesting, I think 2012 that Tanaka Koki represents Japan at the Venice Biennial. And some of the reviewers, I think maybe the reviewer in Hanoi sort of touches on, he didn't even want to go to see the show because he thought it was all going to be manga, otaku inspired, and that's sort of not his thing. But then he saw that Koki Tanaka, who represented Japan at the Venice Biennial and is seen as this major, serious contemporary art figure, is included in this exhibition, drew him to the show. So there is sort of a growth of understanding globally of Japanese art standings, at least of the micropop generation. And I don't know exactly what that owes to. I would say, though, that maybe Matsui-san and others contextualizing this generation and the work circulating globally, I would hope plays some part in that understanding. Interestingly, I think beyond Tanaka Koki, Izumi Taro later on goes on more recently to have a major show in Basel, Switzerland, at the Tongli Museum. And I think Aya Takano also has some major museum exhibitions. So there is more visibility and on a less minor scale that is generated from this exhibition and from these theories.
Thank you very much. Yes, it is true. So unlike the exhibition mentioned by the Tamaki, later, they talked about the exhibition held in a major museum as well. And if the researchers make the literature study, then the major, the articles in the major papers or the periodicals become the major media. Maybe we should see the various media which is growing today. Well, Ms. The Fox, your the comment. I have a question. I am a researcher of the art history, so I'm not an expertise of the museum and its administration and its systems. So department, they own the space in a museum, and the exhibition utilizing those, the spaces contributing to the exposure of the contemporary art, and also enable the research of the the specialist or the expert through those the exhibits. That's what I was interested in. The museum department has the designated space, ceramics, wood prints, and the picture videos are exhibited. I think the number of exhibits increased due to those factors. However, that fact, if we consider the modern contemporary arts introduction and to expand the understanding of those works among the wider audience, is it contributing? Does this structure of the museum's exhibition is a positive factor? Is it a positive factor for that the bigger purpose of increasing the overall standing and understanding of the Japanese contemporary arts? The designated space and the department, the exhibit sometimes have the function of limiting the needs or the understanding in the designated genre or the category, like within the the images or within the ceramics, only the audience who are interested in genre. But if we try to make, attract more popular general public to the value of the Japanese contemporary art, how does this museum system relate to the bigger goal? And also the demand is on the grass and the centering on the U.S. and Europe. The curators are mainly collecting the works of the Western the works, but now the museum is trying to hire the diverse curators. I think that is a very welcome the trend. Excuse me for the trouble. Sorry, my area has the hazard alert, and I just received the evacuation, the caution, the warning. But let me continue anyway. I'm in my study, so I think this place is safe. So let me continue. So, my question with Ms. Foxwell is that I think it's a very complicated issue, however. If I'm from Japan, but I'm a researcher of the U.S. The arts and acquired a PhD in the U.S. fine arts in the U.S. The institution, and the Tamaki and Ritter. You are all the researcher of Japan and Japanese arts, and the do you sometimes feel that your function is limited to the advocate of the Japanese arts? Don't you feel that it is a kind of limitation labeled from outside? Like if you try to advocate the diversity or the inclusion, the researcher himself herself has to bear the certain role. That role is not necessarily from your the voluntary choice, but sometimes expected from outside. So I would like to ask your comment or opinion on those relations.
Thank you very much, Kajiya-san, and I hope you're safe. Please prioritize your safety. And thank you for these interesting questions. I'll start with your first question about the museum departments. And I think that one thing, when I, maybe about 10 years, more than 10 years ago, Kanazawa Bijutsu Daigaku, I think the College of Art and Design in Kanazawa, some researchers wanted to collaborate with me to do a conference on Kolge and contemporary Kolge. And that was the first time that I started looking into how museums handle so-called Kolge versus art. And my impression at the time was that this Kolge was not part of contemporary art, so it was kind of awkward. It was not part of traditional art, but it was not part of contemporary art, so it's kind of it's floating without a home. And therefore, it's awkward. And as you say, perhaps only people who are specifically interested in that craft technique might look at it. However, within the 10 years from then until now, I was fascinated to see that somehow that seems to be no longer the case, that those things have an awkward existence. And so I felt no hesitance about including Chikunsai, the fourth bamboo installation works, or contemporary ceramics and Nishida Jun in my list of contemporary art, even though some curators actually said to me, "Oh, I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, because our museum had this exhibition, but do you even call that contemporary art?" And I feel that the times are changing and people's views are changing very rapidly. And museum goers now are very flexible and fluid. And maybe because they don't remember a time when contemporary art equals painting and sculpture. Like contemporary art for them was always mixed media. What is it like inter or geijutsu, sentan geijutsu, those kind of outside installation performance. So to them, if it takes the form of ceramic or bamboo or oil or enamel, they don't care. It just all, they see it and they enjoy it. And then so now I feel like this is a wonderful opportunity that no longer do we have to be segregated by medium. And when you go into the museum space, it's because each museum is trying to be more inclusive, then it creates a really a diverse and much less regimented space than before. So I feel like the many big museums that I went to, I didn't have to go to one corner to see Japanese art and another corner to see, medieval French, enamels or whatever. That I can go all around and really, I don't know if you feel the same way, my panelists, but so I think that this is a great development, and people's understanding of contemporary art is inclusive. Another thing is that people understand that artists are themselves kind of, many of them are not inhabitants of one country, or they might work and live in different countries. And maybe the world it's easier for people to have more than one home these days because travel is much easier and communication is easier. So I think that our viewers and especially my students don't go in with the understanding, oh, where is this person from? They're just going in with the understanding, oh, this is a really interesting object. And what is some relevant info from this person's cultural background that I need to appreciate this object? So for example, Art Institute had an exhibition of Noda Tetsuya, his prints and objects. And I sent my students to write on that, and they loved that exhibition. And turns out everyone loves him. They completely understand. Okay, his wife is Israeli. He's lived here. He's lived there, and all his works reflect his layered identity. And his son is one way, he's another way, and so people get that. It's now part of our reality. So I think that maybe the future for these exhibitions too, and is people are not going to expect you to adhere to one idea of Japan or a country. So perhaps that segues into your second question about whether I feel like I have a label or a special designation to Japan. And then I guess for me, I feel like I've tried to learn Japanese language, and so I do projects where that can be useful, and that's true of all of us. That we look at what kind of skills do we have, and how can we use those skills. So I guess I try to see look at the understanding that people have, and is there a way that knowing Japanese language or knowing some history of Japan can help enhance that art or that experience. I'm not sure if that's a complete answer, but maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。確かに、まず、
Thank you.
現代美術、
Yes,
コンテン
when
ポラリ
we
ーアート
think of contemporary
といった時に、やっぱりその
art,
ある特定のイメージをその
we
思い浮かべが
tend
ちなんです
to
けれど
have
も、
a bias on the
今
image
という
that we
ちょっ
have.
と
As
広いその
you mentioned, Chelsea, we should have a broader idea, like including ceramic or bamboo, and perhaps to include all those things as well is also essential. And the second question that I raised, as you mentioned, when we think of the skills or the technique or the capabilities that we have, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have to necessarily worry about the concern that I raised. And we have actually two questions being raised from our online participants. But before that, I would like to suggest that the panelists themselves ask questions to each other if you have any.
I have a question for Chelsea. I was fascinated by the discrepancy between the number of exhibitions in different categories that your research divulged, and that the ceramics, um, although that category seemed to include bamboo, but ceramics and photography were kind of the top top categories in a way that moves against what you were just now saying about how people are willing to look at anything anywhere. If those media categories are kind of at the top, my own interests have also gravitated to those two media recently, but in the 80s, I was speculating in my paper that there was still a hierarchy that maybe elevated categories such as ceramics and maybe photography because they were less threatening to the old Kantian hierarchy of painting and sculpture being the most formidable creative genius fora for expression. Um, so, and yet I can hardly imagine that's still the case. Or is it that maybe they're seen as easy and that Japan has a stake for excelling in those areas? What I kind of vaguely remember uh, Martin Friedman saying back in the 1980s when he was curating or preparing for Tokyo Form and Spirit. There's nothing really that interesting in Japanese painting and sculpture and art, but the graphic design is really good, and the architecture and the fashion. These areas are they reach international standards. I mean, of course, now who would say such a thing? That's really preposterous. But um, it, is there a vestige of that maybe at work there? What do you have any further thoughts in that area?
That's a great question, and also I have thought that about Postwar Hanga, right? Japanese prints, right? Oh, here is an area, regardless of whether it's a woodblock print or it's a mezzotin or it's whatever, but like this is an area where Japanese genius can be, it's a space for them to flourish and they're within these confines, right? And so, but then I find that of course, if that's the case, then it's mostly subconscious, right? I'm not ascribing that the American museums are strategizing or thinking in this way, right? There's a kind of subconscious reinforcement of certain genres where Japanese art is acknowledged and allowed to flourish. However, when we think about the practicalities of the museum, now most departments are being told that they can't do a tenjikaya, right? They can't do reinstallation multiple times a year, which is required for a traditional Japanese work like hanging scrolls and screens, works on paper. And so prints are good because they're the cheapest thing to mount. They're easy to store. They're matted in set sizes, so you just pop them in the frame and hang them on the wall. And ceramics can stay out for essentially forever, it seems, if they're properly encased. And so I don't know whether this is just another cost-saving method on the part of these museums. And then I have heard other curators say, certain dealers are really energetic advocates for ceramics and other crafts, contemporary crafts. And so there are many enthusiastic collectors in the US, and perhaps this is also why they have such a strong presence in the museum. So I don't know. Were you going to add something?
I was just going to add to that, having worked in large U.S. encyclopedic collecting museums, photography, but especially say bamboo works or ceramics are infinitely more accessible market-wise than contemporary art. I mean, for a contemporary art museum's budget, you might have, one, and I'm not advocating for this, but one Kusama piece that takes up literally the entire year's budget. Whereas you could buy 10 shows worth of ceramic and stage 10 more shows of Japanese ceramics or bamboo work. Whereas, so I think it has also to do with, as Chelsea was saying, you know, the kind of medium specific or these department specific, the budgets that are also related to acquisition. Contemporary art is sort of a more global department, and so it is you're up against, you know, someone advocating for a Japanese contemporary artwork is going to be up against, you know, some major artist that is potentially from Latin America, from Germany, whereas, you know, there are set budgets specifically for ceramics, and they're able to bring this into the collection and show it more readily. So I think that's also part of it. I think another part is that many of these institutions, at least in the United States, missed the opportunity to acquire these contemporary artists. So whether, and even, you know, say post-war, you know, Gutai is now, you know, infinitely more expensive than it was, you know, 10 years ago. And so a museum that maybe like the Walker during Kathy Albright's time, that made a conscious effort to diversify and globalize their their modern and contemporary collections, was at the forefront of acquiring some of those objects, whereas many other museums cannot afford to bring that material into the collection anymore. So the market drivers are, and these very skilled dealers are there is a lot of that kind of, it's not really behind the scenes.
Yeah, and then, oh, I just lost my train of thought, but with the budget, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, but that's really interesting. Thank you.
On another topic, in connection with the Japan Foundation program for sending exhibitions to like minor venues that you were talking about 5 years ago, I was invited to Ljubljana in Slovenia for a very small Japan Foundation funded exhibition of Japanese prints at a art school, at an art college. And it was a small group. They asked me to just talk about the work, and there were art students. I mean, it wasn't Berlin or Paris, and it wasn't a big museum. But they were very interesting works. They were modest in scale, but it allowed for a kind of off the beaten path conversation with a very special atmosphere and distinctive kind of gathering and discussion that I think really deserves the support that it received, and can't be, you know, that kind of function really couldn't take place in a major big city art museum.
No, and I think, you know, Matsui and myself in the presentation, you know, we use the term minor, but it's not pejorative. That, you know, minor can also be intimate, and that can be equally as important, or equally have, you know, these kind of reverberations, whether it be a kind of one-on-one experience with an artwork. I mean, even though when I saw, well, both at the Har Museum and at the JACCC, when I saw Winter Garden, you know, it was very modest, but it was also a very intimate interaction with the artwork. There was a lot of time that you could take to, you know, look at the details. Whereas, you know, one example would be, say, a Kusama exhibition where you're literally shuffled through every like 5 minutes. You know, you only have 5 minutes to see the show, and we got to get another customer in. It's a different mentality. So I don't want to come off as saying that the more modest and that these touring exhibitions can't be as important. I think they can have really important significance to, you know, an audience somewhere maybe farther flung, further afield. But that is what, and the reviews sort of bear that out. That's what they remember about Japanese contemporary art or micropop in say that situation, and it has a kind of lasting impact.
Remembered what I was going to say, and then I have a question for you, Gabriel. I was going to say that if curators could get approval to go travel and network with emerging artists, then they could make smart acquisitions. But it seems that some museums are so large and bureaucratic, it might be difficult for that level of forward thinking. I don't know, but yeah. But my question was, in terms of, I know that the name Micropop, it's the curator, right? Matsui's name.
Midori.
And since I struggled with how to talk about popular and subculture in my talk, I wonder if you can comment about this term. Is this because I was fascinated by the conceptual level that seemed to relate to me with bricolage, right? This idea of conceptually making a space for yourself by rearranging elements from a major and perhaps oppressive culture. And so I think that can be done without rearranging elements from pop culture. And so I guess I'm curious about, do all these artists use elements that we would consider pop in some way? And is that term too confusing? Yeah, any thoughts around that matter?
I think in the way that Matsui conceptualizes it, she is, and I'm not going to remember every aspect of the thesis, but she does, pop doesn't have to equal popular culture, or pop also doesn't have to equal the way, say, 60s pop art was pulling from that material. I think she's looking more at the banality of everyday life. So it doesn't have to necessarily be popular culture. It can also be rooted in these kind of interior worlds of the artist. And as if it's sort of pulling from disparate aspects of daily life or one's immediate surroundings, it still is valid or still falls under her category of micropop. So it's not, she uses pop, I guess, maybe more liberally.
Thanks.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Now, I think we have received 2 questions from online. So I'd like to share that with you. The first one, this is a question from Mika Yoshitake. So this is about the overseas galleries and the private collection or collectors. What are the role of them? The role of the overseas galleries and the private collections or collectors. Particularly, museum scale, the exhibitions of Japanese works, and also the publications regarding Japanese art. What are their roles if the galleries and private collections are involved in? The Yoshitake's planned exhibition that was mentioned today is a good example.
Is it a question for a specific person or everyone?
すみません。これ、この質問というのは、
This
登壇者の方が見えて
question,
ますか？あるいは、通訳の方が、英語の質問なんですけれども。
well, actually, this is a question in English, and do we have the people
大丈夫ですか？
who?
じゃあ、はい、すみません。
Okay,
他
I
にはですね、
understood that.
こうした、試みの、
This is just a general question. Now, also, the question continues, what do you think about the efforts of the galleries and private collections to present the Japanese contemporary work in their settings?
コレクションのその言説っていうのを、
And
トランスナショナルに広げていると。
I think that they are expanding Japanese contemporary arts in the role of trans-regional. So maybe this question is regarding what is the role of the galleries and private collections in terms of presenting the Japanese contemporary arts in the framework of the trans-region. And it also continues saying that sometimes even museums will not be able to realize or perform this task. So those are the 2 points or the 2 questions from Yoshitake. I think it's quite Gabriel. I think you used to work for the private gallery like a Glam and Poe.
I
So
think well, first, hi Mika, how are you? And thank you for the question. I think it kind of points to in Chelsea your presentation and also your kind of plea for what you described as a kind of art ecosystem based approach. And one that might be, I don't know, in the context of commercial galleries, if equitable is the right word, but I think they serve a really important purpose because the ecosystem as it stands is broken. You know, the shows, I mean, we're speaking here because the work that, you know, whether it be Japan Foundation, ourselves as curators or researchers, it maybe isn't making its way out into the world. And so through these, you know, larger institutions, the museum, collecting museum, and so the galleries, on the one hand, see, I think, an opportunistic role. Their motivation is commercial, but they also are getting much smarter about how they go about that, and they're connecting with important experts who can contextualize and bring together the loans that are necessary to create, you know, the context and the understanding that the museums aren't willing to or the bureaucracy makes too difficult to realize in a timely way. So, you know, Yoshitake-san's exhibitions on Monoha and then on the 80s, I would have loved to see those at large, you know, U.S. institutions, but I don't know if there was interest or the wherewithal to get those off the ground. So in that sense, you know, my hat's off to her and to Blum and Poe for realizing these shows, because at the moment, you know, who else is doing that? I think though you do have to go back to the motivation, and so, you know, if it is about creating a market, which, you know, these galleries are very good at, I think they do a good job of creating this market. But I think that then begets maybe more public interest, which then, you know, begets more attention to scholarly work that may have been overlooked. So I think they serve a really important role within the current art ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel. And I would agree. And especially since I am guilty for excluding them from my survey, I will just say that I only excluded them in order because museums give us a more conservative picture of what is out there, but where so I wanted to see like what is this and also I didn't include a lot of university museums, so by excluding them it certainly wasn't a comment on the galleries at all. And in fact, all the curators whom I interviewed made a point of saying how important galleries were in having really the the great and only opportunity for us to see a lot of great contemporary Japanese art in the U.S. And my chart that I made also included, you know, sponsors, and we know that both publicly and behind the scenes, both the galleries and collectors have made a lot of these shows at least partially possible. And so, and further, they have wonderful websites. And so, when I need to research about living artists, I'm relying on the research that's provided on the galleries' websites and images. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。では2つ目の質問に移りましょうか。中川直之
The second question from Naoyuki Nakagawa.
日本のそ
And the
の
Japanese
アーティストインフルエン
artists
ス
and the Japanese program AIR, Artist in Residence, or the Japanese the site for the support of artists, how are they accepted or they appreciated abroad, or they not appreciated? The AIR in Japan is often situated in the leading edge big cities like Tokyo, and there are some AI arts in the very traditional the cities, but does it attract you? And if not, what kind of element is necessary for us to make Japanese AI more attractive?
Maybe we're stumped by how to relate this to our topics, but from another perspective, I've been studying an artist who has who had quite a bit of experience with artist residencies. This is a Japanese artist, Koye Ryoji, potter and installation artist, who had quite a number of experiences as an artist in residence in Japan and outside of Japan, especially Spain and the U.S. And at, looking at a career, I mean, this is an earlier generation. I don't know what the questioner is really thinking about, but it's clear that those experiences really removed him from his kind of daily institutionalized routines of art making and really stimulated very different kinds of art making. And it was partly a relief. Sometimes it looked like a vacation. Sometimes it had different functions. It engaged him with other artistic circles. So that's a kind of historical perspective on this issue that really endorses the importance of it for an artist's development, I would say. But I'm not sure if that's what the question.
ありがとうございます。まあ、
Thank you very much for your input.
アーティストインレジデンスのやはり
The
その重要
artist
な
in
役
the
割っていうのがあっ
residence's
て、
role
本当
is
は今
important,
回必ずしも
the
海
generally
外
speaking.
での需要という
The
ことです
demand
ので、
of the
ちょっと
AIR
ここま
in
でとさせてい
Japan,
ただきます。
there is
次の質問は
we cannot go further in deep detailed
ボルデン
information.
さんからで
The
すね。
next question is
はい、
from
まあ
the
デンマー
the
クで
girl
も似
held
たような、
ball
ハゲ大
Glynn
学の方で
from
す
the
が、デンマークでも似
Copenhagen
たような、
University.
状
The
況があると。
I
で、まあ
recognize
自
that
然
some
と
of
か
the
ポップ
same
カルチ
trends
ャー
in Denmark,
が、
especially the
注
trend
目
for
さ
the
れていますね。
1990s complementary
だと思うんですが、そ
trajectories
の
of
点は
nature and pop culture. There were a lot of exhibition of
日本の展覧
contemporary
会は
Japanese
最近はない
photography,
んだと。
especially the female
で、
photographers
まあ
in the
それ
late
は日本のソフ
1990s
トパ
and
ワーの
2000.
価値
However,
が
recently
明らかに
there's
なる。
been no Japan exhibition in
で、
Denmark. Perhaps Japan has
研
lost
究者の
its
方にお伺い
soft
したいの
power
は、
value, or the
まあ、
Danish
これがどうなってい
curators
くのだ
have
ろうかと。
moved away.
ネーションベー
Well,
ス
the
の
question
日
is
本の
the
現代美術展覧会
nation-based
というのは、
contemporary
こ
Japanese
れからも
arts
あるのだろう
exhibit.
か。
Do you
も
think
しあ
that
るとした
that
ら、どの
will
ような
take
ものなの
place
だろう
in
か
the
ということ
future?
ですね。
And if so, what are the feature of those Japan nation-based the Japanese contemporary
I
arts
was
going
reading a
forward?
paper about contemporary Korean art, and in that paper, I encountered that certain certain Korean artists have made it known that they're not planning to exhibit in any nation-based shows anymore. And so I don't know if this is also a thing for Japan, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe Bert, this is a question for you.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I think that globalization really has changed the kind of status of national identity, but I also think that there have been powerful countervailing forces that have really rolled back some of the globalization that seemed so unstoppable. Um, and I keep on reciting Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, and coronavirus as forces that oppose the increasing density of border crossing activity that is so closely identified with globalization. So with the retrenchment to borders and with the decrease in border crossing, um, uh, no doubt there is going to be a resurgence of nationalism, and nationalism, I think, is one of the um, uh, foundations of the nation-based exhibition. There are many forms of nationalism. Some are poison, and others are are more beneficial to the citizens of the nation in question, how they benefit the people on the other side of those borders is a big problem. But to kind of focus more on what is probably the nature of the question, I do think that the kinds of exhibitions that focus on nations more recently have tended to acknowledge the porosity of these borders and the fluidity. I mean, I think I'm reciting things that we've heard yesterday and today over and over again. The plurality of identity and the failure of the nation to serve as a tool for comprehending every aspect of all of the people that live there. There are a lot of reasons why national nation-based exhibitions really need to be rethought and need to be calibrated to these other kinds of identity. And I think a lot of curators are doing that. A lot of people in this room. I know the Mori Art Museum is definitely, putting together exhibitions that bring in all kinds of people that, that really reflect the diversity of the contents of national culture. And I think that's very important to incorporate the diaspora of any nation, to be honest about the internal divisions. All of these, I feel like I'm spouting a frequent refrain that is pretty much familiar at this point, but maybe not.
ありがとうございます。そうおっしゃる通りですね。日本
Yeah,
の
thank you
文
for
化
your comment.
の、
It's very
まあ、
true.
多様
The
性とか
Japanese
流動性
culture's
とか、その中
diversity,
である様々
fluidity,
な要素
and the
が出
various
てくるっていうこと
elements
が、
that
まあ、今後は
is,
必要だろうと
embedded
考えられ
in
てい
it.
るのはまさに
All these diverse factors
あ
need
と
to
すみません、
have
2分弱
more,
なんですけれ
the
ども、ぜひ会場
consideration
からの
that
質問を受け
also
たいんです
will
が、
be
会場の方
should
い
be
かがですか？
reflected on how the art is
ど
presented.
なたか
Shall I take?
質問ある
Well,
方います
can we
か？
take the question from the floor?
マイクの方お願いい
And
たしま
please
す。
speak to the microphone.
お三人さん、お話を大変興味深く聞かせていただき
Thank
ま
you
してあり
very
がとうございま
much.
した。
I
今
have
日のお話を少し
been
重ねて
finding
いく
this
と、
very
ちょっとでき
interesting.
るところの質問を
And
させてい
my
ただきたい
question
と思うん
might
です
be
が、
overlapping
今日
and
のです
not
ね、
necessarily
課題の質
overlapping,
問なん
and
ですけれども、
talking about how
美
the
術館のコレク
exhibits
ショ
should
ン、
be
どなた
managed.
の
And when we think
参加
about the
されている方、
collection,
ミュージアムの方々
I
に
went
ちょ
to
っと
the
こちらの
Metropolitan
アジア部門
Museum
が
the
あ
other
るん
day,
で
and
す
I
けど、そ
found
れで
the
はです
Asian
ね、
division. And
どういっ
other
た
than
とこ
that,
ろ
I
に
found a
どう
division
思われますか？
for modern and
それでは
contemporary
各
art.
インスティテューションではそのように
And
考
I
えられ
think
てい
in
るという
major
ことがお
US
話しされていまし
institutions,
て、
that's how you
こ
draw the
の
line.
日本の
Now,
今お話の中でも野田哲也さんの名前が出ていま
I
した
also
けれ
heard
ども、
the
野田哲也
name Noda Tetsuya
現代美術に
and
参加でき
other
る縄浩平
modern
さんなんか
artists
は
like Nawa
モダンコ
Kohei,
ンテンポラリーの収
and
集、
they
日
have
本の収集ではなくてアジア部門
been
の収
included
集
in the
で
Asian
行
division,
わ
not
れ
in
て
the
いる
modern and
ということです
contemporary
ね。
arts. That's what I
それ
found.
でお
So
話の
having
中で
said
はその
that,
ファームベースと
we also
いただい
discussed
たことが
the
これから先どうなるかという
national-based
話もありま
exhibit
したけれど
and
も、
its
一方
future
でそういう
prospects.
国籍、地域
So
によ
when
っ
we
ての
think
カテ
of
ゴライズっていうのは
nation-based
続
or
いていく今
region-based
後もあるのかなという
grouping,
ことが
will
あ
this
るところなん
still
ですけども、
continue?
一つ
Well,
今
I
日お
think,
話しあっ
I
たこの
personally think
7回の
it
アジア
will.
型というのは
So
少し
when
お
we
ずれが
think
ある
of
かもし
how
れ
the
ませんけ
exhibits
れど
should
も、
be held and
そうい
managed
うカテ
moving
ゴライズをされ
forward,
た作
and
品の収
thinking
集
about
と
the
いうことがそれぞれ展示を
categorization,
される、そういう
eventually,
定
well,
説の
there
作ら
would
れ
be
方っていう
also
のもあると思うので、
exhibits
その
being
辺り
made
の
and
解説でらっ
also
しゃるか、
the
ご質
thesis
問
or
なども
theories
これ
being
からお時
um,
間あればぜひ
made
お願
from
いいた
that.
しま
And
す。
what's your view on this?
どなたでも。
I can just speak from an institutional perspective in the, and I'm just from my own experience within U.S. museums, the way that an object is classified within the collection often has to do with which curator brought it into the collection. So if a curator of Asian art brought the object into the collection, it is sort of under their domain, and so they can readily exhibit it in their galleries kind of at any time. And the same often occurs for, say, the curator of modern and contemporary art. If they were the one to bring it into the collection, they immediately have it kind of ready at their fingertips to bring into any sort of permanent collection display. But I know that a lot of museums, at least within the US, are trying to shake that up. But interestingly, there's also, whether it be from the public or from critics, there's criticism that without having this, whether it be cultural specificity, maybe medium specificity, or that specialized knowledge, it will just be this kind of universalizing endeavor, and it's just, this looks like this, looks like this, and there isn't that kind of meaty significance or context that's happening. So I think, LACMA in Los Angeles is redoing their entire building on this new model. And there are proponents for it. There are also, people who are very much against it. I think, I'm all for the recontextualizing of objects, but I think if that happens without knowledge or without a nod to the difference, the cultural difference, then you are erasing, the intention of the object, or you're erasing the history or the cultural specificity of that piece. So I think that's, it could be dangerous. But I also think there needs to be ways to have global conversations about how, certain concepts run through, global art narratives. Pili gave, and via, Dorian's video presentation on this conceptually based approach, I thought that was very convincing. And I think that's a really interesting way to start to shape a collection. But it's also only one way to do that, I think. And Pili did kind of spoke to, this is an initial approach to M+, and I'm sure there will be other approaches later. So, not having one monolithic, we will only do either the past way or this new way, and it's written in stone and it can't change. I think having that, the openness to rethinking the collection constantly is important.
ありがとうございます。バートさん話されますか？
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just
would you like-
add, I think that was a very effective encapsulation of the issues here. And what I would only add is a kind of historical perspective, which is that if you go back a couple of decades in American museum history, the situation was that people in museums with responsibility for Asian art really were not fluent in the methods and the theories and the strategies of modern and contemporary art. They were really trained in studying Asian art of early periods. And conversely, people who were trained in the fields of modern art, modern and contemporary art certainly, they really didn't have skills to kind of negotiate non-Euro-American art, the meanings and values and cultural difference. They were really unprepared to do that. And it started to change. And I think it's really late, that it started to change probably in the 80s, when you started to have people like Alexandra Monroe, who were specialists in Japanese or Asian contemporary art, that moved into the museum and kind of took that responsibility on and kind of blurred that difference. And there are more now, and more people like that all the time who are working with languages and cultures from outside Euro America to kind of diversify the collections.
ありがとうございます。状況は変わりつつあるの。
Thank you. Things are now changing, I should say. We were supposed to end at 12:30, and we are slightly running over time, but I would still like to take questions if there are anyone from the venue. It's not a question, rather I would like to add on some comments. So with the Japan Foundation, thank you very much for talking about us. And Winter Garden that Chelsea mentioned, Ritter mentioned. Well, that's the kind of the traveling exhibition is what we are doing, but it's not just only for contemporary arts that we are doing, but also for architecture and for poetry, pottery and ceramics. These are also kind of the collections that we travel from one place to another in the exhibits. And when we do this, it's the Japan Foundation. It's not the Japan Foundation trying to look for venues, but we also contact the consulate office and the embassy, and through the secretariat office that we have, we try to look for a good location, and that's the kind of system that we have. So it's not always that we do this on the foundation of contemporary and modern art, but rather it's more of a targeting to introduce Japanese culture, and that's how we decide the venue. That's why we do have limitations, and we also want to try to reach out general audience. And well, we could also think that as an advantage, but I just wanted to add on that from the Japan Foundation. And Chelsea also mentioned about that there are also people who don't have opportunities, or curators saying that they don't have opportunities to research about Japan modern art. And there's this Ishibashi Foundation that Japan Foundation is working together, and we try to offer fellowship programs to those scholars that are wanting to research. And from 1 to 3 months' time, it's a short-term thing, but we offer the fellowship program and allow them to make research on Japanese modern and contemporary art. So if anyone is interested, please do refer that person to us. And actually, deadline for the recent fellowship program will be December 1. Thank you for sharing with us some valuable information. Are we all fine? I'm really happy that we were able to have a lot of fruitful discussions under an interesting topic, and we wanted to cover more, but in the interest of time, we should respect the 3-hour period. And by the way, this will also be disclosed on YouTube and it will be archived. So I encourage that more discussions will be carried out based on today's session. Thank you very much, our panelists, Bert, Winther-Tamaki, Gabriel, Ritter, and Chelsea Foxwell. We would like to really thank you for this session. And I also thank the participants, the secretariat, and the interpreters. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. A big round of applause. And hereby, we would like to conclude session 3. Thank you.